The smoke reaches you before the soldiers do. It always does. You smell the village burning before you hear the screaming, a thick, oily black column rising somewhere over the tree line. And you know without being told that you have perhaps an hour before the men who caused it arrive at your door. You are not a soldier, you have no sword, you have a field, a cow, and 3 children who have not eaten properly in 6 weeks. What do? You have been asking yourself this question for 11 years. You will be asking it for the rest of your life, however long that turns out to be. Half the people you grew up beside are already gone. Some died in their beds, some died on roads, some simply left one morning and never came back, and you do not know which of those 3 endings is the worst. The question that lives at the center of your days, the one you cannot answer and cannot stop asking, is this: was there ever a version of this world in which ordinary people were allowed simply to survive? This was the 100 Years' War. Not the war of kings and chronicles and glittering knights tilting at each other across manicured tournament fields. The other war. The one fought on every road, in every field, in every bed where the dying outnumbered the living, and once it began, no wall, no saint, no harvest was enough to hold it back. France in the 1330s was not the wasteland history imagines it to be. Contradicting the assumption that medieval peasants lived in perpetual misery and darkness, the French countryside in the early 14th century was, by most measures of the era, thriving. The warm centuries of the High Middle Ages had produced population growth across the continent. France alone held perhaps 18 million people, more than it would again for 200 years. Villages were dense with activity. Markets connected towns to each other along ancient Roman roads, and those roads carried not just goods but ideas, news, and the slow grinding machinery of commerce that made the whole system cohere. Peasant life was hard but not hopeless. A good harvest meant surplus. Surplus meant small comforts, a bit of bacon hung by the fire, a pair of shoes that fit, a daughter married into a slightly better situation than the one she was born into. The rural economy had its own architecture. Strip fields divided the land into long, narrow holdings farmed by families tied to the rhythms of oxen and weather. Lords took a portion, the church took a portion, and what remained was enough, in a good year, to sustain a household. This was not abundance, but it was a world that worked, and the people inside it understood its rules. They understood the rhythm of Lent and harvest. They understood the hierarchy of saints and saints' days. They understood, with the fatalism of people who have no other option, that the rain would come when it came, and the Lord would take what he took, and life would continue in its slow turning. What they did not yet understand was that this world was already marked. At its very apex, the mechanism of its undoing was assembling itself quietly in a palace in Paris. The French crown, passed from Philip IV to his 3 sons in rapid succession, had failed to produce a stable heir. When Charles IV died in 1328 without a male successor, a throne-sized question opened at the heart of the kingdom. Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV through his mother Isabella, believed he had a legitimate claim to it. The French court, applying Salic law, the rule that no woman could transmit a royal title, disagreed. The throne passed to Philip of Valois instead. Edward accepted this, for a time. The formal beginning can be dated precisely to October 1337. Philip VI of France declared the Duchy of Aquitaine forfeited, seized from the English crown, and Edward III responded by laying formal claim to the throne of France itself. What had been a dynastic grievance became a declaration. The legal machinery of medieval kingship had been cranked into a posture that could only resolve itself through blood, and the blood that would flow was almost entirely that of people who had no say in the question. The first phase of fighting produced results that should have been militarily impossible. At Crécy in August 1346, an English army equipped with massed longbowmen reduced a force of French knights to a scattered pile of horses and heraldic wreckage. The longbow, a weapon that took years to master and could kill an armoured man at 200 yards, exposed the central fantasy of the medieval military order, that a knight on horseback was invincible. At Crécy, roughly 4,000 English archers killed somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 French nobles and knights in a single afternoon. The specific horror of that number matters, because it meant the French nobility had been catastrophically hollowed out, and the cost of replacing them would fall, as it always did, on the people who grew the food. After Crécy came the siege of Calais. The English blockaded the city for nearly a year. Jean de Venette, a Carmelite friar who had been born to a peasant family in central France and who would spend the following decades documenting the war from the perspective of ordinary people, wrote that the countryside surrounding the English army was not full of men as it once was, but reduced to a pitiful state, deserted, uncultivated. The granaries had been emptied to feed armies. The roads were unsafe, but the mechanism had only just started its work. In the autumn of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The sailors were dead or dying, their bodies covered in black swellings the size of eggs, bleeding from every opening. Port authorities ordered the ships out of harbour immediately. It was already too late. The plague had arrived in Europe, and it moved with a speed that no army, no king, no wall could match. It would reach France within months, and when it did, it found a population that the war had already begun to hollow out, weakened, displaced, and entirely without defences. It came through Marseille first, a port city, and therefore the worst possible entry point for a contagion that travelled with trade. From Marseille it spread north and inland, following the same roads that merchants used, the same rivers that carried grain, the same valleys that connected market town to market town. As it spread, it met a population already paying the first installments of a debt it had not agreed to. Normandy was one of the first great agricultural heartlands to understand what was coming. The fields were rich there, some of the most productive land in Europe, and the villages were dense. When the pestilence arrived in the summer of 1348, the dying began in the poorest quarters first, in the cramped houses along the narrow streets where the air was thick and sleep came in shared beds. A village might lose a quarter of its people in 6 weeks, then another quarter. Then the survivors found they could not bury the dead fast enough. Jean de Venette recorded that in Paris alone, the Hôtel Dieu, the main hospital, was piling bodies 3 and 4 deep in the same beds, while the living sat beside them, not knowing yet that they were next. In Burgundy, to the southeast, the wine harvest of 1348 rotted on the vine. There were not enough people left alive to pick it. In Champagne, villages that had existed continuously since the Roman period were simply abandoned, houses standing empty, fields reverting to scrub, centuries of human labour pressed into farmable land beginning to undo themselves inside a single decade. The first medieval forest clearances, generations of axe and fire that had carved arable land from wilderness, reversed themselves quietly as the wilderness came back. Further south, in the Languedoc, the plague triggered violence alongside grief. Jewish communities were blamed, accused of poisoning wells that no amount of rational argument could demonstrate had been poisoned. Massacres occurred in several towns before Pope Clement VI, resident in Avignon, issued a bull condemning the violence. The bull was largely ignored. The Loire Valley, the breadbasket of central France, lost perhaps a third of its total population by 1351. The surviving peasants found themselves in an almost paradoxical position. There was suddenly more land available than there were hands to work it. But the lords who owned the land refused to reduce their demands. Rents remained high. Labour services remained mandatory. The people who were still alive were being asked to do the work of the dead on top of their own, and the lords collecting those rents were doing it from behind the walls of manors they could not leave for fear of the same plague. Then the English came back. The Black Prince, Edward III's eldest son, led a series of military raids into southern France called chevauchées. The explicit purpose of a chevauchée was not to take territory, but to destroy it, burn the crops, slaughter the livestock, level the mills and the granaries, strip the countryside of everything that could sustain life or generate tax revenue for the French crown. It was economic warfare waged directly and deliberately against peasants, and it was understood as such by everyone involved. Knights who had sworn their swords to God and chivalry rode through villages with torches, and the villages burned. In 1355 and 1356, the Black Prince's campaigns cut a burning corridor 300 kilometers long through the south of France. Towns were sacked, villages were razed. The systematic destruction was thorough enough that contemporary accounts describe roads flanked by smouldering ruins for days at a time. In September 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, the English captured King John II of France himself. The ransom demanded, 3 million gold crowns, was roughly twice the annual revenue of the French crown. It would have to be raised from taxation, from the villages that had already been burning. If you had been a French peasant in the winter of 1358, you would have been paying 3 catastrophic bills at once. The war tax to fund the king's ransom, the lord's rent on land you could barely farm because half the men in your village were dead or fled, and the price of food that had tripled because the harvests were failing and the roads between markets were controlled by roving bands of soldiers for hire called routiers. The free companies, who had found that peace was considerably less profitable than extortion. The routiers were perhaps the most precise expression of what the war did to ordinary life. When truces were signed between England and France, the professional soldiers who had been fighting were not paid off and sent home. They were simply released, thousands of armed, experienced, and entirely immoral men with no income and no land, moving through a countryside that had no mechanism to stop them. They formed bands. They occupied castles. They demanded payment from villages in exchange for not burning them. When the villages paid, the routiers moved to the next village. When the villagers could not pay, the routiers burned them and moved on. Jean de Venette wrote that by the late 1350s, many villages in the Ile-de-France had been destroyed not once but twice. Once by English forces and once by the free companies nominally fighting for France. There was no one to till the fields, he recorded. Wolves came down from the forests and ate the bodies of those who had died of want. It was in this context, in May 1358, that the Jacquerie erupted. A peasant uprising burst from the Beauvaisis, north of Paris. Named mockingly after Jacques Bonhomme, the generic French nickname for a peasant, meaning good man, in the most dismissive register available. The uprising was not planned and not ideological. It was the physical expression of a population that had reached a terminal point of compression. Peasants attacked noble estates, killed nobles, burned chateaux. The violence was savage and short. The nobility regrouped, crushed it within weeks, and executed thousands. But the Jacquerie had demonstrated something that could not be undone by execution. The people who grew the food had finally said, in the only language the system left available to them, that the system existed to destroy them. The medicine of the era could not touch what was killing people. Plague was understood in humoral terms, an imbalance of the body's 4 fundamental fluids, and the treatments prescribed by university-trained physicians included bleeding, dietary restriction, and aromatic herbs intended to purify the corrupted air. None of it worked, because none of it was designed for a bacterium that killed in 3 days and spread through contact and breath. The surgeons who opened the black swellings to drain them, believing they were releasing corrupt humours, were the most exposed of all. Many of them died first. The church, which had provided the conceptual framework for every aspect of daily life, its rituals marking birth, marriage, harvest, and death, had no answer either. The Pope was in Avignon rather than Rome, a situation that already troubled the faithful, and the initial theological response to the plague was that it was divine punishment for sin. Flagellant movements spread across France, bands of men whipping themselves publicly in acts of penance, trying to buy back divine mercy with displayed suffering. The Church tolerated them, then condemned them, then watched them dissipate when the plague showed no sign of caring about penance. Then came the Great Schism of 1378, which produced 2 competing popes simultaneously. And the institution that was supposed to hold the cosmos together fractured openly in front of everyone who depended on it. Local government failed at the most basic level of protection. The feudal bargain had always been explicit. The peasant gave labour and a portion of the harvest. The lord gave military protection and order. But the lords could not protect against plague. They could not protect against the routiers, many of whom were better armed than any given lord's retinue. They collected the rents and the taxes and offered nothing in return except the privilege of remaining alive, which was increasingly not within their power to guarantee. By 1400, France had lost perhaps a third of its entire population from the combined effects of war, plague, and famine. By some regional estimates, the Seine basin, the agricultural and commercial heart of the kingdom, had lost closer to half. These are not statistics that can be fully processed as numbers. Think of them instead as presence and absence. A village of 60 households reduced to 30. A market town whose tanner's quarter stood empty and silent. A stretch of road where the inns had closed because there were not enough travellers left to pay for a room. Fields where the furrows were still visible, but nothing grew in them, because no one was left to plant. The second-order consequences compounded across generations. Depopulation meant labour scarcity, which paradoxically strengthened the bargaining position of surviving peasants over time, but only across decades of violence and instability that none of the living could have seen through. In the short term, the emptied countryside invited further disorder. Wolves reclaimed territory that humans had cleared across centuries. The forests came back. In some regions of Normandy and the Ile-de-France, entire villages entered the historical record only as deserted sites. In French, villages désertés, known now only because archaeologists have found their foundations in fields that have been farmland again for 500 years. The economic collapse was total in some areas. Coin currency disappeared from rural transactions, barter returned. The sophisticated market networks that had connected French towns before the war took generations to rebuild. The 100 Years' War ended in 1453. The English were expelled from all of France except Calais. Joan of Arc had been burned at Rouen 22 years earlier, a peasant girl from Lorraine who had heard voices, led armies, and become the most potent symbol of a French national identity that the war itself had forged in suffering. That is perhaps the strangest and most exact irony available to this history. The war that came closest to destroying France as a functioning society also created France as a nation. The survivors had been forced to understand themselves as French rather than Burgundian or Norman or Gascon, because the enemy had been everywhere and the distinction between regions had ceased to matter when the routiers were burning everything without preference. The peasants who endured it did not live to see most of this. They died in their fields and their hovels and the ditches beside the roads, and their names were not recorded, and their suffering was documented only by the occasional friar or chronicler who thought ordinary people worth noting. But the world they left behind, depleted, battered, and unmistakably transformed, was the soil in which something genuinely new began to grow. The 100 Years' War did not simply ravage France. In its long burning, it destroyed the medieval world that had produced it, and from the ruins built the conditions for everything that came after.